Hello everyone, I'm Kaylee Sacker with Theogony, TC William High School student-run media organization. Welcome to today's episode of Behind the Headlines. We're coming to you from Alexandria City Public Schools television studio at TC Williams with a roundtable discussion with Alexandria journalists. Let's meet our panel. Michael Lee Pope is an author and reporter for Virginia Public Radio and a longtime observer of Alexandria events. Alexa Epitropoulos is a reporter for the Alexandria Times. Dan Brendel is a reporter who covers Alexandria for the Alexandria Gazette. Today we will be talking about Amazon's announcement that they will be coming to our area, restaurant tax in Alexandria's waterfront. Let's turn to the issue regarding restaurant tax. So people who eat at Alexandria restaurants will now be financing Alexandria's affordable housing fund. Do you think that this is a good idea?
Well, they always were. So it's an increase, like 4 to 5% basically. And it does mean an increase in the affordable housing fund that the city just sets aside for projects. I think that you saw a lot of opposition going on because restaurants were really upset because they felt they had a high tax rate already. They're not paying it, but their customers are. They feel it's a deterrent, and I think that there's some credence to that. I don't think it will stop people from coming necessarily, but I think that business owners were kind of upset, and I think that you saw that reflected in the election.
Dan?
I mean, again, I don't know. I'm not a finance whiz. I don't know if I'm qualified to say whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. I do know we talked again in the last segment about how a huge bulk of the city's money comes from taxes on property, either people who own houses, residences or commercial space. They pay tax on the value of their property, and that accounts for something like 60-70%, I think, of all city revenues. And there's been a long time, before I ever arrived here, there's been discussion about how do you diversify the revenues of the city, right? As she said, there's always been a meals tax. There's a whole gazillion kinds of taxes and fees and things that the city collects for that other part of the pie. But so I don't know if the restaurant tax specifically is a good idea, but having something other than just raising property taxes, that's probably a good idea, diversifying. So finding other revenue streams to do the things that we want. And it is one of those other streams. So
the real question here is who pays for all these affordable housing projects? The thinking a decade ago was that you add a penny onto the real estate tax rate. And so essentially property owners, people who own mainly residential properties, would be paying into that affordable housing fund. Now there's been a shift in thinking, and that penny set aside no longer exists for the most part. And so they did this thing with the restaurant tax to have, let's say, people who eat in Alexandria restaurants pay for it. Well, that actually encompasses a whole lot of people that don't own property in Alexandria, will never own property in Alexandria, tourists and people who come here from our neighboring jurisdictions. And we'll raise about $5 million a year. I think that's the expectation. Well, that's there's a whole lot of affordable housing projects going on. I mean, you could talk about the need for affordable housing, but if you actually talk about projects and the city's affordable housing money that goes into that, there's $9 million for the Spire, $9 million for the Carpenter Shelter, $8 million for Farrington Presbyterian Church, $6 million for the Gateway Apartments. All that stuff adds up, and you got to pay for it somehow. That's why the thinking was, well, you make the people eating an Alexandria restaurant pay for them.
Well, I think part of the thinking of restaurants specifically too is that they employ people, service people who are probably going to be earning the lower kind of wages, who are the very people who would benefit most from affordable housing. So that some advocates would say that there's a fairness aspect that it would be applied to restaurant businesses specifically.
Okay, all right, let's finish up with the transformation of Alexandria's waterfront. So Alexandria's waterfront, the transformation to being a premier public space appears to be happening. Dan, what do you believe the successes are of this and what still needs to happen?
successes, I would say, probably come a couple of weeks ago. Michael here hosted a panel similar to this with past former city council members. One of them, I think, was David Speck, said that a lot of people who live in that area are pretty upset about the building and stuff that's going to take place with this, right? Well, he said, which I thought made a lot of sense, that the biggest danger is what happens if we don't develop the waterfront. As we've talked about numerous times in the two segments now already, the city faces major revenue problems now and in the foreseeable future. So, and we've talked about how most of tax revenue comes from property as well. So if we're not going to develop more property to increase the tax base, then we either got to spend less or we got to find it somewhere else. And there really isn't a whole lot of somewhere else. So is it the most ideal thing? I don't know. The people who live there don't think so, and that's certainly, there's something to be said for that. But I don't really know what the alternative is. So I'd say the biggest success story is hopefully the increase in tax base that will come out of it.
Thank you. Alexa, do you have anything to add?
I think part of the impetus for waterfront development now is the competition that Alexandria is facing across the river in DC. The wharf has been talked about a lot, but I think it's really pivotal to act now. Otherwise, you're going to lose regional tourism, and that's a major driver for Alexandria's economy. I think that there are success stories, there are creative compromises. I think the Old Dominion Boat Club relocating, that was a very controversial thing, but you get this beautiful park that's going to open pretty soon, hopefully, out of it. And it shows that when people come to the table, there can be compromises, and I think this particular one is a success story.
The thing that's striking about the waterfront is for generations, the dream has been that you would be able to walk up and down the waterfront continuously and not be stopped by industrial sites and fences and warehouses. And so finally that's coming into fruition. You can actually see this coming up out of the ground. And so it will be very soon where you can make that walk up and down the waterfront. But that is after years and years and actually decades of arguing over what should be done there. I spent some time in the library looking at previous waterfront plans because there was one in the 60s and one in the 70s and one in the 80s. And if you go back to one that was in I think it was the 60s, one of the proposals was to put an elevated highway on the waterfront. An elevated highway on the Alexandria waterfront that would be exactly what, by the way, Georgetown has with the Whitehorse Freeway. So if you think about Georgetown's waterfront, Alexandria's waterfront could be like that. And it's not. In fact, I think people in Alexandria would say what we're going to end up with is much better. But that's mainly the function of neglect over a long period of time and not coming to a conclusion because of all the bickering and fighting. So, what's emerging now is actually a compromise forged over decades of time.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions or suggestion topics for our panel, please email us at tctheogony@gmail.com. Thank you, and join us next time at Behind the Headlines.